Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. And thank you to all of our panelists who have taken the time to join us and spent time preparing information to share. My name is Dr. Catherine Garupa White, and I'm the Executive Director of the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAC, and I'm also one of the co-chairs for the Air Resources Board's Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, or EJAC, that's advising them on the update of the 2022 scoping plan. This is not an official meeting of the EJAC because we are below quorum. However, it has been coordinated through our EJAC work groups as an informational and educational opportunity for decision makers and members of the public. So tonight it's been set up in this webinar format where you'll be hearing from a set of panelists and presenters. The meeting is being recorded so that we'll be able to share it later. I also want to thank CARB staff for helping provide the Zoom line and the interpretation, and for the staff support of Trish Johnson. Tonight is about engineered carbon capture, use, and storage as a climate dead end. These are not just proposed assumptions in a plan, but these are real projects that are impacting our communities. CVAC and environmental justice organizations and partners from across the state have been educating community and decision makers, which is our goal for tonight. Carbon can be stored naturally through practices like composting, urban forestry, avoiding use of fertilizers, and wetland restoration. California's San Joaquin Valley used to have many more wetlands and riparian habitats that have been converted for uses like farming and housing. Some land, especially in priority areas, could be converted back and have multiple benefits like flood control and creation of wildlife habitat. Our forests, if properly managed, could also naturally store carbon. Unfortunately, wildfires are releasing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere and are getting worse with rising temperatures. In case you haven't heard, why CVAC has been doing this work for almost 2 decades now is because California's San Joaquin Valley is the most polluted air basin in the United States for fine particles and competes with the South Coast for being the most polluted for ozone. We've had epidemic levels of sickness because of our air pollution problems in the San Joaquin Valley, with serious impacts to people's health and quality of life. Now we're confronting yet another strategy that is a dead end to achieving climate justice. Engineered carbon capture, use, and storage, or CCUS, is a method that removes CO2 at the source of power plants and industrial smokestacks, injecting it underground in pockets normally filled with either saline water or oil and gas in them. And if not injected on site, it also requires transport of the carbon. Every aspect of the process poses risks to our communities. And based on the geology and the history of oil and gas drilling in the San Joaquin Valley, our region has been identified as, quote unquote, one of the most promising areas for carbon storage in California. While coincidentally, a researcher the other day said that part of why they know where to store things in the San Joaquin Valley is because that's where they have data from industry. We know of proposed projects in numerous communities in our region, many of them in already overburdened environmental justice communities like Mendota, McFarland, Delano, and Stockton. And you'll hear about some of those projects and other projects of concern in other parts of the state tonight as well. CCUS supporters argue that this is a clean technology, but CCUS is expensive and has not proven to be effective and can contribute to more unhealthy air, oil spills, and water contamination. Again, there are many risks like groundwater contamination, triggering earthquakes and leaks that can lead to suffocation and death of nearby residents. There's much more that will be shared by our panelists tonight, so that was just some of the highlights and quick overviews. So Tonight, myself and fellow co-chair of the EJAC, Martha Dina Arguello from Physicians for Social Responsibility, will be serving as your moderators and passing between the speakers. And then we have a lineup based partly on the geography of where these projects are proposed and the types of projects that they are. So first we'll hear from a team at Center for Biological Diversity and an organizer at Central California Environmental Justice Network about projects proposed in Fresno and Kern counties. We'll take a short break and then we'll hear from panelists with Communities for a Better Environment about proposed projects in California's refinery communities. And then we'll be rounded out by Matt Holmes with Little Manila Rising discussing proposed projects in the San Joaquin Sacramento Delta region. And do want to acknowledge that tonight, wherever we're joining, we are participating from unceded tribal lands. And with that, I want to pass it to my co-moderator, Martha Dina Arguello, to introduce herself and provide additional background. Actually, really quickly, I also wanted to mention the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee has put together recommendations about CCUS, and I'll be highlighting and going over these again at the end. But for now, I want to pass it over to Martha Dina for her overarching comments as well. And thank you for helping support this event, Martha. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen because I've been working on a lot of PowerPoints over the last few months as we've seen and the environmental justice community. So the onslaught of technologies that are yet unproven that are moving toward us. And as the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, it has been incumbent on us to do self-education, but also begin to talk to our colleagues about what is happening with engineered carbon removal and what we see as efforts to include this in the scoping plan. So we can't forget, carbon, it's not benign. And on these sites where they're storing carbon, there is danger of leaks and asphyxiation. And so there are health impacts. And there are also health impacts that are embedded in extending the life of fossil fuels, which is what we are really nervous about. We believe in the precautionary principle, and it is something that the EJAC has deeply supported over the years, and that we should, particularly with these technologies that extend the life of the very thing that got us here, and two, that they may be hard to reverse. And so we enter this, it is still an unproven technology that requires a whole lot of public investment and requires a whole lot of incredibly stringent regulations, of which we, given, as environmental justice communities, we actually know what that regulatory failure looks like and feels like, and that it is actually impacting people's ability to breathe clean air. When we say we're going to regulate something and then fail, particularly given that we've got major regions of the state in non-attainment with the Clean Air Act. But it is also a focus on carbon that I think is mistaken. We often say carbon is the co-pollutant. And if you just think about carbon and if you try to commodify carbon, well, then these are the solutions that are being put forward, right? So this is direct air capture. Sucks it out of the air, it filters it with some chemicals, which would be interesting to know what those chemicals are, because most chemicals are not benign. And then they filter what happens to those filters. And then it's concentrated, stored, or transformed into other goods, right? So it's a type of perverse circular economy that tells us, let's continue to circulate fossil fuels, carbon, and the things that got us into this climate crisis in the first place. Let's continue to circulate them through the economy through fuels and plastics and other materials, when what we should be doing is figuring out a transition. And the reason, and I'm gonna Catherine, tell me if I'm going over too long. What we've seen is that these projects are being sited on top of existing fossil fuel infrastructure in facilities that actually, as Catherine said, had been closed by the communities because of the threat that they posed. And so we, as the EJAC, see that the bulk of the scoping plan and AB 32 solutions right now are actually continuing to drive those burdens into low-income communities that are already affected, and others will reap the benefits. So California is prime for CCUS because California is an oil state. So we've got the refinery capacity, we've got the pipelines, all of those things are there. And it's apparently some folks want to extract as much carbon out of there and commodify it and keep it circulating. So I think that's incredibly dangerous. It's the reason we've been very nervous about this unproven technology. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing because I could go on, but so part of what we have been asking is, should this process be done? Who is funding this? Who benefits and who bears the burdens? Those are some of the key questions that we're asking, as well as, and you'll be hearing today about where the technology is, what this technology opens the door for in terms of other practices that are questionable in terms of getting us out of the justice problem that we have, that is environmental racism, as well as the climate crisis. And I also work on toxics, so we can't just think about fossil fuels. We should think about fossil fuel as the feedstock to many other toxic industries that we need to transition so that local economies can thrive, and actually we're not choosing between health and a job. So I'll stop there and hand it to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Martha Dina. So with that, we want to go ahead and kick off our panels. And first, we're going to hear about some projects proposed for Fresno and Kern counties. I'm going to pass it over to Shay at Center for Biological Diversity, and really want to appreciate the support that they and partners Central California Environmental Justice Network have been providing us in figuring out what's going on with these projects. So over to you, Shay.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Thanks, Martha Dina, for the overview of CCS. And I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Is everyone able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Shay Wolf. I'm the Climate Science Director with the Center for Biological Diversity, and I'm here with my colleagues, Victoria Bogdan Tejeda and Liz Jones. And we're going to talk about the many BECCS and CCS projects that are being pushed in California. I mean, particularly focusing on the Central Valley projects. And we've heard an overview of CCS, and I was going to start with an overview of BECCS to get us situated. So what is BECCS? BECCS stands for bioenergy with CCS. And so BECCS projects take a bioenergy facility which burns crop and tree biomass to produce electricity and fuels emitting carbon dioxide and air pollutants, and adds CCS equipment to that to divert some of the CO2 from the smokestack. And many of us are familiar with the harms from bioenergy facilities, that they're polluting, expensive, that cutting trees for bioenergy is ineffective for wildfire safety, and that they're ecologically harmful. And so putting CCS equipment on bioenergy facilities adds all of the risks from CCS that Martha Dina talked about, and keeps the harms from bioenergy facilities. So it is putting two problematic polluting technologies together. And I wanted to briefly talk about some of the harms from bioenergy facilities that adding CCS equipment does not solve. And the first is that biomass energy is really polluting for our communities and the climate. That these facilities emit large amounts of particulate matter, NOx, and other pollutants. They're often located in Central Valley communities already overburdened with pollution. These facilities have repeated air pollution violations that have led to shutting down some facilities like the Mendota biomass facility and the Blue Lake Power biomass plant. And they're more climate polluting at the smokestack than coal. So it's California's dirtiest electricity source, and it is not carbon neutral. So adding CCS equipment to bioenergy plants at best diverts some of the CO2 from the smokestack, but leaves a lot of the carbon dioxide and air pollution problems. Second, biomass energy is expensive. Biomass power is California's most expensive electricity source, adding to our power bills. That takes resources away from clean solar and wind. So adding CCS equipment to bioenergy facilities makes that electricity even more expensive. And also, thinning forest for bioenergy is not effective for protecting communities from wildfire and smoke. Thinning is not proven to reduce wildfire smoke. And what California should be investing in instead is what works, which is preparing homes and communities to be fire safe. That's home hardening, that's providing air filtration systems and fire and smoke shelters, and prioritizing our most vulnerable communities for those efforts. So given all of these risks, like how is BECCS being pushed in California? An industry is pushing BECCS under the claim that it is carbon negative, meaning that BECCS will remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but BECCS is not proven to be carbon negative. And if you look at the center of this panel, it shows what BECCS actually looks like in practice. And you can see throughout the process that there are many places where CO2 and air pollutants are being emitted. So starting with cutting trees, which ends their carbon storage and sequestration, the fertilizer and pesticide use, the emissions from the cutting, from the transporting the biomass in trucks, emissions from processing the biomass, from drying and grinding and pelleting, the emissions from the smokestack, only some of which may be diverted by CCS, and then the risks from any stored carbon dioxide leaking and being released. So if we look at like a real world example of a BECCS project, we can look at Archer Daniels Midland BECCS project in Illinois, which is a corn ethanol plant, and it is not carbon negative. It is storing half of its CO2 target. It's estimated that this facility produces 4 times more CO2 emissions than it stores, and it has received hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money. It's very expensive. So another way the industry is pushing BECCS is by saying that we cannot achieve the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius target without BECCS. But if we look at the latest IPCC report that came out earlier this year, there are 1.5 degree pathways that do not require BECCS. I mean, they do require faster fossil fuel phase out, but BECCS is not necessary for meeting the 1.5 degree climate limit. And the IPCC has acknowledged that BECCS is uncertain, that it poses risks to air quality, water, soil, resilience, our livelihoods, food security, and biodiversity. And just finally, BECCS projects are not just being pushed in California, but around the world. And this 1,500 member organization, Climate Action Work International, put out a position against BECCS because of its unacceptable negative impacts on food security, land rights, and biodiversity, and that it hasn't shown that it's carbon negative. So I'm going to stop with that overview and pass things along to Victoria and Liz to talk about specific projects.
Thank you, Shay. Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria, an attorney with Center for Biological Diversity, and I will run through a few specific proposed CCS and BECCS projects in California. Next, please. So we know that there are quite a number of proposed projects in California. The ones with the little star next to them are the ones that we will discuss tonight, but I just wanted to put a large part of the list up here just so that we're all aware of the huge number of projects that are being proposed, and there are more, but these are the ones that we have the most information about. Next, please. But first, I want to start with the basics of permitting, just because I'll be using some of these phrases in my slides. And so, like most industrial projects, there are Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act permits, and land use permits. Those are usually at the municipal level, like the city or the county, and you can see CEQA review coming from that. But one distinguishing feature with carbon capture projects are the carbon storage wells, and there are 2 different kinds, and they're either class 2 or class 6. And class 2 wells involve taking the captured carbon and injecting it underground in order to extract more fossil fuels. And then class 6 is meant for storage of the carbon. And what's important here with that is that CalGEM, the state agency, has permitting authority over the class 2 wells, and EPA has authority over the class 6. Next, please. So the first project portrait I want to show is Mendota, and there is a bit of a victory here because the Class 6 permit that EPA was working on was withdrawn. And so huge credit goes to CVAC and CCEJN for that. This doesn't mean that we may not see the project come back, but for right now, EPA looked at their permit application and saw that there were lots of problems with it, including that the project didn't have enough money to monitor the site over time. And so that one was withdrawn, which hopefully gives people some hope. But this project, if it were to happen, would be terrible for the community. You can see in the picture here that my colleague Shay took that this project would take place at the old Covanta Mendota biomass plant that's really in the backyard of a community. And this company wants to take that biomass power plant that community members work so hard to close and bring it back online and combine it with carbon capture and storage. And what's especially dangerous about this is that they proposed injecting the carbon directly underneath the facility, so right next to these homes. And as we learned earlier, if there's a leak of this carbon, it can harm people or even kill them. So that was a big concern. So we know that the Air District also has been working on their air permit. We know that the company has been in talks about the land use permit. So this is something to keep an eye on. Next slide, please. Now, the same company that wants to do the Mendota project also wants to take the old Covanta Delano biomass power plant that has also been idled and shut down and bring that back online. So this is the same company with the same model. And this one is a little further behind in the process. So we don't know if they want a Class 2 well or a Class 6 well, but we know that they began their process of getting an air permit. So the same company and likely very similar problems. Next, please. And I wanted to also raise a project by a different company called San Joaquin Renewables. And their premise here is that they would take different kinds of agricultural waste and turn it into this transportation fuel. And the project location is in McFarland. And similar to Mendota, the company wants to inject the captured carbon right under the facility. And that's a big problem no matter where you are. And here it's a problem because that site is around 3 miles away from the town. So that means 3 miles away from homes and schools and hospitals. And so that's very dangerous to the community there. And so this company is looking to get a permit for a Class 6 well from EPA. So whenever that happens, if they make it far enough, that will come out for public comment. We don't know anything yet about the air permit or the land use permit, but we regularly submit Public Records Act requests to the agencies to try and stay on top of this, because otherwise, there isn't a great way to get information. Next, please. And finally, this is not a BECCS project, but I wanted to bring it to people's attention because it's fairly new. We learned about this just last week, and it's Chevron wanting to put CCS on top of their natural gas-fired power plant, the East Ridge Power Plant near Bakersfield. And so this would keep this fossil fueled power plant alive. But as we heard, all of these CCS projects that have existed have failed to meet their targets. And so this would allow fossil fuels to continue while only possibly capturing a little bit of their carbon. So we don't know yet whether they want to use it to take out more oil from the ground. All we know is that they've gone to the county and said that they want a land use permit, so that there's likely to be a CEQA process on that sometime soon. So that is very similar to the project then that my colleague Liz will discuss next, and I will pass it to her.
Thank you. I'm Liz Jones with the Center for Biological Diversity, and I am now going to take a few minutes to talk about the CCS project in California that is the furthest along in permitting and some of the issues that we've identified with the project so far. So this is also not a BECCS project. It's a project from Carbon TerraVault, and it would be located in the Elk Hills oil field. And that's next to Button Willow near Taft. The proposal is to take carbon from some, as of now, undisclosed source and then convert wells in the oil field that were drilled several decades ago and convert them into long-term storage wells. And the applicant, which is a subsidiary of the oil company California Resources Corporation, has been working with Kern County on the environmental review and the land use permits that it needs. And it's also submitted 2 applications to EPA that EPA is now reviewing for long-term Class 6 injection permits. Next slide, please. So despite being the furthest along in the permitting process, we've seen that there's a lot of conflicting information about this project, including the total amount of carbon that will be injected there. The lifespan of the project is still unclear. And we also have seen that in different applications, there's been different numbers presented about the annual injection rate. You can see that in the slide here. And we've also noticed that the operator has said that it may or may not pair a long-term Class 6 storage project with a Class 2 project that would be for enhanced oil recovery at the field and would involve drilling injection wells that would increase oil and gas production in the field. Next slide, please. The applications to both Kern County and EPA are also, in our view, missing really critical information. So you see here that there's not been an attempt to identify the source of carbon for the project, and they also have not described how they will transport carbon to the site because they don't know what the source is. Next slide, please. And so we've been emphasizing in comments to Kern County and will in comments to EPA is that these missing project pieces are really important because the source of the carbon, the method of transport are intimately tied with the environmental harms, and they need to be disclosed and analyzed and mitigated. So for example, the most likely source of carbon that has been identified for the project so far is the gas plant that powers operations of the field. And in one of the applications requesting approval for injection, they've noted that the injection project would be for 26 years and start in 2025. And if that's the case, then that timeline would extend the life of the gas plant and the oil field that it powers beyond, for example, the target date that Governor Newsom has identified for phasing out oil and gas extraction in California. It would extend the life of the plant beyond the retirement date that the CPUC has identified and really just prolong reliance on fossil fuels and not be a climate solution. And another example is that of the environmental harms that are really tied to these missing pieces of information is that depending on the transportation route, the operators identified that compressed carbon could pass within a quarter mile of schools. So finally, the next slide. I wanted to wrap up with this map, which shows that the project is located in an area that California EPA designates as disadvantaged because of the level of pollution burden relative to other areas of California. And as my colleague mentioned, the Central Valley really should not be a dumping ground for additional projects that are going to increase air pollution and put communities at risk. So the next steps for this project is the CEQA environmental review. We submitted comments earlier this year on the scope of that review, and we may see a draft environmental impact report later this year that we would comment on. And we're also in the process of drafting a letter to EPA about the deficiencies in the applications that we hope to send in soon. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Rocio Madrigal, who is an organizer with Central California Environmental Justice Network and also from Mendota. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful explanation. My name is Rocio. I grew up in Mendota and I work with Central California Environmental Justice Network. We do many different projects, but all of them around environmental justice. You know, we believe that clean air, clean water should be a human right and equal to everyone. Well, we learned while working there in this rural community that it's the cantaloupe capital of the world. It has lots of beautiful cultures. The favorite dish that we and Marta Guzman from EPA enjoyed, the pupusas that they are wonderful. And we had a good time there. We met with about 30 families that live in what is a mobile park, but really they are mixed shift RVs that are permanent housing for these families. They are about a quarter mile, if that. You saw the picture. I don't know if they can put it on again. It is literally right behind these people's homes. And about 3 blocks away is the high school and the middle school. So this biomass, with the addition of the carbon, would be so detrimental to the people, the families there. A few months ago, when we did knock on their doors and asked if they had any idea that Chevron and this clean energy systems were applying for permits and wanting to put this in their community, we were shocked to know that they did not know. I spoke to leaders. We do several events there in the community, and pastors and leaders also did not know. And so this was very concerning to us, because once they did know, and once we were able to talk to them, people remembered that the biomass that's been idle for 10 years, it was active for many years before that. And those same residents, the ones that lived there 30 years ago, remember the smell, remember how foul and ugly the sky looked. They remembered that it was a constant, even the noise. They're so close that the noise was a burden for them 24 hours a day. So they know what it's like, and they don't want it. And right away they said, please give us papers. We'll collect signatures. I mean, they don't want it because they know that it's bad. It's bad for the entire town. This is a small town of about 18,000 people. I'd say less than a 10-mile radius. So everybody in the town really would be affected. I apologize. I took so many notes. These makeshift RVs, as I said, they're made of aluminum. And so they don't count with centralized AC like we have. They have swamp coolers. And so, as you may understand, when the temperature gets hot, they have to turn on their swamp coolers. Their swamp coolers bring in all the PM 2.5 that they'd be breathing. Several members shared with us that their children, their spouse already suffer from respiratory problems. As we know, in the Central Valley and Fresno, San Joaquin area, we have so many issues with asthma that this would only aggravate them even further, along with heart disease, strokes, and other things that are caused by this PM 2.5. You may ask, I said earlier, I was raised in Mendota. I could not be born in Mendota because Mendota did not have a hospital. And despite the very few decades that have passed on, as you can see me, there is still no hospital there. And in a similar project that was done in Yazoo County, Mississippi in February of 2020, when a carbon pipeline ruptured, it required dozens of hospitals to take in at least 140 critically injured people. Now in Mendota, there's no hospital. And in Mendota, there is one ambulance. So being so close to the biomass, some tragic incident would mean many deaths. And that's just not fair to burden these farm working people with respiratory problems, many of them uninsured. Okay, they struggle to even get their annual examinations if they do. So we can't expect these families that are going to get sicker to have money. They don't have money and they don't have insurance. So that is just unconscionable for us to allow that to happen. So we're very thankful to be working and to have been a part of halting, at least for now, that project in Madera. Companies that operate these kind of projects, they say that they capture 80% of the carbon dioxide, but they don't even capture half. Some of them only capture about a 30%. It is the risk of carbon monoxide leakage is for geological storage and pipelines. It's dirty, it's inefficient, it's expensive, and the most thing is that we can't allow this technology that has not been proven, has not been placed anywhere else to go in these people's backyards. If it's so wonderful, if it's so innovative, if it's so great, I've asked in another meeting, well, let's put it in Morgan Hills. Let's put it in some of these Palo Alto or San Luis Obispo areas so they can have the star, of this new projects. But the truth is, it's not. It's dirty. It's just an accident waiting to happen. I also wanted to let you know that even as we speak on Friday, there's a methane leak in Kern. And there was a press release that some of my coworkers worked on. I believe it's the Morning Star that you can read. It came out today. And it talks about what is happening over there. There's no protocol. Nobody checked these old oil wells that were leaking this methane. So they have no idea how long they've been leaking, how much they've been leaking. Our coworkers went door to door telling people about this, and the press release asked for that. There's no protocol for these companies. When something bad happens, oh, well, it's happening. And if anything, they try to hush it. So I ask anyone to really do your research. I mean, we have the research. We have incidents like this awful tragic incident in Mississippi that all we do is have to look for it, and we need to look for alternatives. Lastly, the state has said that outside burning by 2025 will no longer be allowed. So why be looking at something that's going to be burning in 2022 when 3 years from now the state is saying that it's not supposed to happen at all? So we're already decades behind for the federal ozone where we're supposed to be. So why add to that? And why put these people's lives at risk? They're people too, and they need to be treated that way. Thank you. Thanks for your time. And I don't know who's next.
No worries, Rocio, I got you. Thank you so much for joining and for sharing. And thank you again to the Center for Biological Diversity team as well. Really want to underscore what you were saying about health and safety and the lack of protocols, the risks that our communities are being confronted with, and acknowledge that it can be a lot to process, especially when we start to talk about our communities where we know family members, friends, these are real lives and these are real impacts. So wanted to, at this time, go ahead and offer the opportunity for us to take a quick 5-minute break so that people can step away, take a deep breath, take a minute to process. I'll put up a slide with the time to come back. So it'll be around 5:48. We'll ask folks to come back and we will start off with our panel about CCS projects proposed at California's refineries. This is your 1 minute warning. We'll come back and start again in about 1 minute. All right, it's 5:48, so I want to go ahead and invite people to start rejoining as you are able so that we can get started with our next set of panelists. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Connie Cho, fellow EJAC member and attorney with Communities for a Better Environment.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks so much for inviting us and for leadership from folks in the Valley, at PSRLA, at the center, and really want to give a chance for us to talk a little bit about the background of refineries and the threat of CCS in refinery communities. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here for a presentation. And if I can just. I'm here joined by Alicia Rivera, who's from Wilmington and a longtime organizer with Communities for a Better Environment. And a lot of the information that we'll be sharing tonight has been researched and compiled by our senior scientist, Julia May, who's not here tonight, but here in spirit. So a little background on California's refineries. The California's refineries are old, massive, inherently polluting, and dangerous. So the vast majority of the refineries, or the majority of refineries, are really in the Los Angeles area. But second to that is the Bay Area, and the smaller amount of refining capacity can be found in Bakersfield and Santa Maria. And like other EJ communities, Communities for Better Environments organizes where there are predominantly low-income communities of color due to the long legacy of environmental racism, state-sanctioned redlining, and Richmond and Wilmington are our main refinery communities. And today we're going to be focusing on Wilmington with Alicia.
Hello, everyone. Alicia Rivera here with Wilmington, in Wilmington, CBE organizer. And so the area of Wilmington is borders with Carson and West Long Beach. So it's, for AB 617 purposes, is taken as one area of, interest. So we're going to be talking about the three cities as a whole. So Wilmington and Carson have together about a third of the entire state's refinery capacity, all surrounded by houses. Wilmington is a very small area. If you can click, please, Connie, so we get. So Wilmington is very small. It's only about 20 square kilometers. And in there, you can see the names of all these 5 refineries that are either in Wilmington or in the border with Carson, which is one single major refinery complex, as we mentioned. And so imagine having one refinery in a small area, but Wilmington has all these 5. There is one a little further away, the Torrance refinery. So there is a concentration. Next slide, please. So you can imagine these refineries are very close to one another. They are not even a mile away from one another. So imagine the plumes. So all the pollution from all of them together mixes up. So we have this image from the air district showing the annual average refinery air pollution plumes overlapping. This area is ground zero for the state, in the state for oil refineries air pollution. So in Wilmington, cars and trucks are not the biggest pollution source for all pollutants that people are exposed to, because we have the 2 ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So there is extremely terrible amount of trucks going every hour. But despite the extreme transportation emission due to the ports, refinery-related VOCs, PM2.5, and NOx emissions dominate. And so Wilmington gets huge diesel truck emissions as well. Next slide, please. So here, imagine there is this elementary school, Hawaiian Elementary, and it's not even a long block away from the Phillips 66 refinery right here. And on this side toward the east, they have the Valero refinery. So this is what the children are exposed to on a regular basis, experiencing black smoke and flaring and explosions and accidents, incidents at the refineries. Also, Harbor College, more to the north, is about the same distance as this school from Phillips 66. So all the students are suffering from all the pollution. Next slide, please. And so this is the refinery I'm talking about that is close to the elementary school and to Harbor College. This is Phillips 66. And so this is a packet of homes. There is only one cinder block fence dividing the refinery from the homes. And so when you go there, you know, what people see, they don't necessarily get to see the pollution, because this is what it looks like in a good day. Click, please. But emissions are invisible, because they are heating, burning gases inside the heaters and burners, creating heat for the refinery, so that the pollution is on constantly nonstop. And of course, sometimes we get to see you know, what the pollution looks like when we see the black smokes, incidents happening. If it's not one refinery, it's the other. In this case right here, one of the Phillips 66 underground pipeline that was decommissioned for over 20 years was never cleaned up, and it erupted during a very small, you know, earthquake. And so it really just threw oil into people's backyard. So we have collected several images from different major accidents throughout the years. This one really is the same refinery, black smoke, flaring, black smoke, the sulfur tank in this instance that the refinery couldn't explain how it happened. So this is what people in Wilmington and the children are exposed to on a very regular basis. This is one of the latest one last year. This is a graphic from the Channel 5 KTLA. This incident shut down freeways. It was followed by weeks of flaring while they were bringing the refinery back up. So we know that every refinery in the state not only causes constant emission of greenhouse gases, smoke, precursors, and toxic chemicals, but each one of them has had repeated explosions, fires, and flaring events. In the past, refinery workers have even been killed. The ongoing air pollution every day and during accident endanger neighbors, although we have worked successfully for decades with the local air district to pass regulations to reduce emissions. They will never gonna be able to clean the refineries. They are inherently polluting, and we need to phase them out.
Thank you, Alicia. So what is CARB's the Air Resources Board current plan to deal with the immense amount of pollution, danger, and climate emissions coming out of these refineries? Well, we can tell from the modeling, the climate modeling that they've done and the draft that they've written, that they plan to rely heavily on carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. And the key points here that I'm going to draw out here is that they rely on what's called a 90% capture rate to have CCS on all major operations by 2030, and to track petroleum demand, meaning they're not going to actually manage or coordinate a phase down, but just hope that the refineries will stop refining oil as in-state transportation demand for petroleum declines. So the big takeaway that I'm about to do a little bit of a deep dive, but the big takeaway is that CARB's draft is making bad modeling assumptions and policy decisions by not actually having a plan to manage the phase down and relying on ineffective and inapplicable CCS technology for the refinery sector. So the draft actually assumes imaginary refinery emission cuts from CCS. 2 million tons of emissions that are cut starting last year, reaching a peak of 13 million tons in 2030. And as we know, constructing even a normal piece of pollution control onto a refinery means that you have to study it, you have to design it, you have to permit it. And certainly the idea of having it built onto the majority of refinery operations as a climate strategy doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, no California refinery, and remember earlier I said California refineries are old, massive, and inherently polluting and dangerous, but no California refinery has any carbon capture technology on it right now. There are only actually a few small refinery related projects that could be comparable outside of California, and including some examples from Canada that failed to meet their goals in terms of their capture rates, which sit much lower, around 30 to 40%, and of course questionable, as they may or may not be accounting for the entire life cycle of emissions, what it takes to power the carbon capture technology. And these projects are wildly expensive. So an example in a refinery that had a type of hydrogen producing unit where they put CCS on it, they had to build that from the ground up, and that cost billions of dollars and had a slightly higher capture rate there. And hopefully this video works. But this is an aerial of just a small part of the thousands of acres that can be in a California refinery system. The Chevron Richmond refinery is 2,900 acres, for example. But these refineries are extremely dense and complex. And that matters because we actually know from air district regulation processes that refiners have come to regulators and the community to say that they don't actually have space to put in any other pollution controls for NOx, and actually we're able to loosen pollution regulations. And this is because it's well documented that adding new equipment to space-constrained oil refineries increases hazards of explosions and spills and makes maintenance a lot more difficult. And frankly, too dangerous to operate. Also, California's refineries, I just want to highlight here, they can produce, these are massive refineries, second only to, the state of Texas. And we, in these refineries, they can produce up to 380,000 barrels of oil a day. And these refineries are also, near century years old, if nearly a century year old or over 100 years old to begin with. So we're really not actually asking for very much in the scoping plan, to be honest, because it's a complex problem to have these massive pieces of infrastructure that pollute, that have workers, and are sitting on a toxic environmental disaster just waiting to be discovered. And these companies are liable for multi-billion-dollar cleanups. And we don't have any financial assurances really secured in place. Refineries can make up a big chunk of tax bases for communities. And we don't have a plan right now to deal with that declining tax base that happens if we phase out oil refining quickly. But we need to start the plan now for the sake of the climate and for the health of communities. So we're asking for this plan to phase out oil refining by 2045 and immediately invest in the just and equitable transition through a fossil fuel safety net fund for oil workers and communities. This plan, we think, is consistent with CARB's plans for zero emission transportation, and it would be a plan that provided certainty to actually phase out fossil fuels, to solve the toxic smog public health crisis, to protect EJ communities and protects us from absolute climate disaster, instead of spending those billions and billions of dollars on CCS that will only end up justify the extension of the life of these oil refineries.
Thank you so much, Connie and Alicia, for really helping us visualize and understand the threats and challenges related to the proposed projects at refinery communities. Definitely want to underscore the need to start a plan, right? We've heard over and over again from leadership in California, it's like a catchphrase now to say that we're going to have a just transition off fossil fuels. Well, what is actually the plan for that? How that's going to happen, and how will it prioritize frontline communities that have been so disproportionately overburdened? And again, really want to lift up and appreciate that all of the groups on this panel and many in the audience as well are really busy working on so many different issues, now being confronted with tracking these permitting and regulatory processes, this matrix of really unclear sets of regulations, if they do exist, lots of gaps and unanswered questions. We've been requesting meetings with decision makers and pushing them to be accountable to our communities for what these proposed projects mean. And groups like CVAC have been developing a policy platform to put out there, what do we think is necessary? What are the conversations that we need to be having about these projects? We don't think that we need them at all, but if they are going to move forward, what are the considerations, the questions and the challenges that we need to be thinking about? We know that industry has a privileged voice and has been working ahead of us for decades, right? Because they have inequitable access to money and power. And it's a principle of the environmental justice movement that there are no decisions about us without us, and really appreciate how tirelessly the organizers on this call have been working to confront these issues. So with that, I want to segue it over to our last panel about projects that are proposed in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta region and in the city of Stockton. And for that, we're going to hear from Matt Holmes with Little Manila Rising.
Oh, sorry, I thought my camera was on that whole time. Thanks for passing it over. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about this issue. I'm Matt Holmes with Little Manila Rising, masculine pronouns. And I think the fact that anyone is listening to me about this issue is really revealing. I think it shows that we're missing key strategic planning and just sort of basic best practices around research and what kind of questions were asked. The fact that I was able to identify community concerns and research questions that scientists and engineers hadn't bothered to wrestle with yet really should give everybody pause about this rush to this strategy to solve this problem. I will be the first person to say that I would love to have a technological solution to global climate instability, because I know deep at its heart it's a cultural failing, and it's a leftover of global colonization, and this idea that there are sacrificed people and sacrificed places, and that we can still continue to make profit while we undermine the basic foundation of our survivorship. So I wish I would love to say, cool, there's a magic wand, there's a magic engineering trick that can solve this problem. I would love to be for carbon capture, sequestration. I just haven't seen the research done, and I'm not convinced that anybody knows how to do it. So I'm really worried about this rush to judgment and what it means for my region of the state. And so I want to walk you through some of those concerns and how these issues came to our attention here in Stockton. As previous folks have laid out clearly, siting for these projects is based on historic or traditional oil and gas exploration. The subterranean sounding maps are categorically based on a racist history of where people had the temerity to explore for oil and gas, right? Nobody's looking to store carbon underneath Montecito because they never had an opportunity to drill for gas underneath there. Well, that's not true. Kind of offshore they could. But you get my point, that we're really coming with, I'm being told I'm talking too fast. We're really pancaking this new strategy on top of an old infrastructure that I think we can all agree was super unfair. And so I want to start with some of the human health risk stuff that Martha Dina brought up at the beginning of all of this. Carbon itself is not a benign gas. We've used CO2 to sterilize facilities, to chase out rodents, been in classrooms that had poor ventilation, seen brain function and learning decline based on high CO2 levels. We already have laws in California about CO2 concentrations in California and how we're supposed to monitor that and prepare to ventilate classrooms better. And here we are, super concentrating this pollutant and transporting it and storing it in communities that already have really compromised infrastructure. So I wanted to share a slide real quick, because before I get into where they want to talk about storing it and what my primary concern is, I want to talk about the transportation concerns that are really hopefully going to push any implementation of this way out into the future. So Trish, I don't know if you can share that slide or if you want me to do it. I've got it up here if it's cool. Let me try.
Okay, sounds good.
Let me try. So, this is, oh, where'd it go? You guys want to see all my photos? Hold on, let me pull it back up. 1 second. Ideally you'd have a pipeline on stable geography. Here we go. Can you guys see that? You with me? Anybody?
It's a flyer.
Yeah, for an environmental justice virtual symposium.
That was really cool. How about this?
Yes.
There you go.
So, the fact that we're talking about, that we've spent so much time talking about this in the 2022 scoping plan before there's sort of a permanent transportation logistics strategy for this idea, means that, like everything in California, it's going to move by heavy duty truck. It's going to move on traditional transportation infrastructure and facilities, which are, overburdened in low-income communities of color. These heavy-duty trucks up here are going to absolutely increase traffic in my region, which has already been out of attainment with the Clean Air Act for half or a quarter of a century. So starting with that phase is its own problem. Then I love these. These are creative. These are bladder barges. These are barges that would be floated down the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta from the refinery corridor in Contra Costa County, and hopefully attached to injection sites and stored without incident. It looks like pretty sophisticated technology. I know that things happen on the Delta that nobody can have a plan for. And eventually we have rail, and then eventually a pipeline. And so we have a long ways to go before anybody should really be thinking about permitting these types of strategies and pushing these through local land use authorities. But what we're seeing is local project advocates are trying to navigate, whether it's the county or a port or a city property or an existing permit that they have with someone else, to try to get these projects ready to go. And they're pointing to CARB's low carbon fuel standard and saying we're following the protocol. And that protocol is not an adequate permitting strategy. So folks like me are at the community level, we're fielding these threats, and we're fielding people that are trying to push it through on really illiterate local governments and land use planning authorities who have no idea what they're talking about. And, there are people who think they understand the risks around traditional oil and gas injection or extraction. And that's one thing. And I think there's a whole history about the industry cutting corners in that practice and exposing communities and the really predictable pattern of leaks in that infrastructure. And I'm not a scientist, but I can tell you I've talked to a lot of them in the last year and a half. And the viscosity difference between supercritical CO2 and traditional oil and gas, or even saline injection compounds, is night and day. So the idea that folks who can't hold on to fuel oil or natural gas injection wells, that they're going to be able to hold on to supercritical CO2 is a very serious question that folks need to ask tough questions about. And that making that CO2 really does require a high degree of purity to have any sort of reasonable expectation of control over that substance, to be able to get it through transportation and into the injection site. And so this is an important point, because communities like mine and communities in the South Valley are fielding rumors about this strategy, because industry says, I'm going to store my pollution. And when they're talking about CO2, that's one thing. It's an entirely different thing when they're talking about the respiratory irritants like NOx and SOx and all the other things that come out of industrial sources. And, again, I'm not a scientist, but I'm pretty sure terrestrial physics dictates that you can't crush all molecules equally, that you're not storing co-pollutants in the same pipe. And so we have County Board of Supervisor people out there saying, we're going to store all the pollution and the pollution is going to go away. And these industrial sites are going to no longer represent a threat to these communities. And we haven't seen the definitive research from either the national labs, the California Air Resources Board, or the Department of Energy saying, hey guys, you got to stop saying that. That's a crazy claim. You're misleading the public. But all the studies that they do point to absolutely focus on this 98, 99% purity for their supercritical CO2. And so I'm sorry to walk people down a technical component of this injection strategy, but I needed to share with people sort of how communities are getting big leagued around science that frankly land use agencies don't entirely understand. Mm-hmm. And so promises are being made that no one has proven yet. So, we need time to do that research. And it's a perfect example of how community-based participatory research is not some beneficence or charity that formal agencies give to us. It's really an opportunity for formal agencies to get the information that they don't have. And we see time and again in environmental justice communities that the observations and the innovation do come from impacted communities. So there's, I will put this out there and I will lose friends in the environmental justice community. There are potentially ways forward with carbon capture and sequestration when led by communities who understand these things. But from everything that I've seen up until now, I see a poorly researched strategy, a poorly researched portfolio of options, and I see it being installed in already overburdened communities. And I think we've seen folks lay that out nicely already tonight, that we're talking about extending the life of offending sources in communities that communities already have reasonable expectations should have been phased out in the cap and trade scenario, and what we were promised with cap and trade and the greenhouse gas reduction fund. We see people expanding pollution, increasing the activity at offending sources, and even resurrecting long dead sources that should have never been brought back to life. And they're being brought back to life with funny state money and federal money that frankly these companies would have never even taken a look at this strategy if they weren't being incentivized to go try this thing that nobody has proven before. And so the fact that we're fielding this at the community level, generating research questions, asking for resources and partners to help us explore that, should give really everybody pause about this being a serious component of the 2022 scoping plan. And that, yeah, I understand that there are sort of permitting and agreement challenges that do push this way off into the future, and that maybe this will be a more substantive conversation in the next 5-year plan in 2027. But that in the meanwhile, our desire to find an easy solution based on, selecting convenient variables about carbon, this cross of carbon that they're going to hang us on, because carbon apparently is the only thing warming the planet. The fact that we're wrestling with this, carbon myopia means that we're jumping to really one of the last recommendations in the IPCC and one of the least, the least proven strategies when there's really a deep portfolio of the hard work that we all know will work that also renders co-benefits for places like Stockton. So it's really been frustrating to see investment, attention, and energy get poured into the inner delta of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, which has been a disinvested region in California. It's been an identified sacrifice zone for decades. And it's a place that matters to you all. It's a place where most of you get your drinking water. It's a place where most of your food gets sorted and shipped to you. And it's a place where we are just really a couple of storm surges away from losing massive islands, allowing massive seawater intrusion, salt water ruining drinking water infrastructure, levee breaches, unmaintained levee breaches, flooding, tens of thousands of homes. And, that's not in the modeling scenario. What's in the model when you have a whole region of California living in FEMA trailers and most of California fighting over a limited food supply? There are really urgent climate risks in our region. And I feel like we've been distracted from addressing those in proven ways that benefit communities to really turn to this hopeful, I'll call it hopeful, and I'll try to be creative about this, but this strategy that frankly, none of us asked for and doesn't seem to benefit any of us as currently configured. So there are, and I'll close by saying, we have a history of industrial sources that find this appealing and find those public incentives appealing. We also have traditional landowners, small farmers that are having trouble making ends meet, and they're looking for ways to stabilize their land ownership. And right now, the economics of agriculture have them plowing their islands underneath sea level. They're tilling up, ancient peatland, an amazing resource for the sequestration of carbon. They're tilling it, oxidizing it, and sinking it 2 inches a year beneath sea level to raise corn for pigs for silage. And they're in a market that's unforgiving to them. And this scoping plan is the type of place that could provide planning and alternatives for those vital, natural and working land pieces of infrastructure that can really protect communities in the whole state for decades, even centuries to come. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about that, but I think I would say that this has scared folks in our community, and we feel like, we don't have the luxury of being disengaged and entirely oppositional to it. We have to learn about this thing that's been targeted at our community, and it's really hard to be nuanced about that under this rush timeline.
Thank you, Matt. Definitely a lot of important points there. And I think a powerful vision that you've kind of closed us out with, right? I think one of the most common stereotypes that's thrown at us as EJ advocates, organizers, and community members is the idea that we just protest and say no all the time, or we say not in my backyard, but really it's bigger than that, right? And there are a lot of things that we want that we are actively out promoting. CVAC and our colleagues have multiple policy platforms that we're working to advance for healthy and resilient investments in our communities, right? So definitely want to uplift that. I also want to repeat, we are being inundated and confronted and are working to track this not just through the scoping plan, but also at the legislative and regulatory levels, because we understand that it's coming and we are working to respond as fast as we can. We have been recording tonight's webinar, so we will be sharing that out. And I did also want to take a minute to go over what I mentioned just briefly when we started, which was that the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee has developed recommendations specific to the scoping plan about engineered carbon capture, use, and storage assumptions. So just wanted to make sure that we put those on the record. So these are summarized shortened versions of what you can find posted online of our latest EJAC recommendations. So do not consider any engineered carbon removal for fossil fuel infrastructure. Ban the use of captured carbon for use in enhanced oil recovery. Evaluate industry projections and promises of reduced greenhouse gas emissions with a thorough greenhouse gas life cycle analysis conducted by a panel of independent experts. Always prioritize direct emissions reductions. Prioritize ecologically based solutions to naturally sequester carbon by restoring soil and ecosystem health. And ensure that permitting of CCS projects is conditional upon completion of a rigorous health impact analysis. Again, really want to appreciate all of our speakers and everyone who's been supporting the organizing for the event tonight, and pass it back to my co-facilitator, Martha Dina. Oops, sorry, you're on mute still.
Sorry, I want to thank all the speakers and recap, right? What the environmental justice community is saying is that we want to say yes to solutions that are centered on equity, that don't increase the burdens, that don't have us spending massive amounts of public dollars on questionable technologies that are actually crowding out the community-based and community-driven solutions that will get us to a just transition. The Environmental Justice Advisory Committee has also been very, very clear about, as Catherine just showed, what our recommendations are. And, something that wasn't said here, but in our, we were doing a series of learnings internally, and we were trying to find out about cement. And I called someone, and we were happy, and I said, do you think we really need it? And the person said, yes, we really need it. We need a lot of things. And I said, can it be done justly? And he stopped and he said, I don't know. And if it can't be done justly, which means no increased air pollution, no increased burdens to already overburdened communities where the infrastructure lies, where we've been fighting to clean it up for years, I think that's essentially what you're hearing. And that we actually, we also joke that this is the new climate denial. Yes, I believe in climate, but my solutions are actually going to extend the life of the thing that got us here. And so that is and when Matt and others say fear, I live in Los Angeles, and I grew up in near oil wells, and I've been working for many years in Los Angeles to stop oil drilling. And we finally got the city to declare that, close to declaring oil a non-conforming land use. But yet I hear of this policies and these efforts, and I get incredibly, again, worried for the communities who are living and breathing this stuff. And we just can't do it. And I think the other message that we've heard clearly is we should act like carbon is the co-pollutant and stop sort of, this dogma of carbon only, because it is leaving things that we need to create resilient communities off the table and off the policy table, and certainly not funded. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm not sure how we're going to do questions because I'm not used to using the format.
So there's a raise hand feature, so people can raise their hands and we can call on them. I also wanted to see, just before we open it up, if any of the panelists or people on the panelist side who can just unmute themselves had comments or questions that they wanted to raise.
Yeah, I do want to add a little bit to the biomass presentation that was given. Growing up in Delano, the Delano biomass plant was just you could see smoke even a couple miles away. So I attended a middle school that was nearby, and just really do want to stress that the smell is terrible. I did not know what the plant was at the time. I'm grateful that it did close, and I'm really concerned about it potentially opening back up. At the time, a local group had gotten together called the Delano Guardians, and they did a great job of just tracking the violations that were coming from the facility. And actually in the summer before it closed, they made around 30 reports with the support of CCEJN. And that led over to $30,000 in fines. And they found that they were also incinerating illegal stuff to make kind of that unburnable stuff burnable. So it's not just untreated wood chips or waste that's being burned. And Kern County is one of the furthest counties to meet attainment in the San Joaquin Valley. So definitely do not want to see these biomass plants come back online, and just appreciate everyone's research backing that, and really looking forward to pushing the EJAC's recommendations and meeting some allies in the audience who want to combat CCS.
Thanks, Jasmine. Did you just want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
Sorry, hi everyone, I'm Jasmine Martinez. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm the coordinator with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. And as I mentioned, I'm based in Kern, so I work in our Southern Valley.
Okay, So we ask that you keep it brief, that you ask a question, and hopefully hopefully we can answer it. And if we can, we'll figure out a way to get it answered. I see that Al Slater has had his hand up for most of the webinar. So Al, do you really have your hand up, or?
Yes. I just wanted to know whether you were aware of Senate Bill 1314, which would outlaw CCS for enhanced oil. That's my question.
Yes, we are aware and engaging, and Catherine and many others have been engaging in that process.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Al. That's actually a bill that our coalition is sponsoring, and many other groups on this panel and a part of this workshop are definitely closely tracking efforts to pass Senate Bill 1314 by Senator Monique Limon, which would make it so that CCUS projects can't be coupled with enhanced oil recovery, which of course we're very concerned about the continuation of propping up the dirty, polluting fossil fuel industry that everyone has spoken so powerfully to. Did you have any other questions, Al?
No.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Al. Gordon Nip, please ask your question. Unmute yourself, Gordon, so you can ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Gordon Nip. I'm the vice chair of the local Sierra Club chapter in Bakersfield. I'm hoping that we can sort of connect with the CBD folks who have been, I guess that you must have written some comments on the notice of preparation for the California Resources project. I wrote some comments on it myself, and on the NOP. I'm not an expert on any of these things, and I'm hoping that when they actually come out with a draft EIR, that we can kind of work together and get some expertise involved in this. I've talked a bit with the Earth Justice folks, and they may be interested, and I've talked with the Sierra Club Environmental Law Program, and they may be interested as well. But I think we really do need to focus on this, and I'm hoping that we can work together with the CBD folks on this. If you have written comments on the NOP, I would be pleased to have you to see them, and I would be happy to send you the ones that I send in. Although, like I say, I'm not an expert on these things, but I do have some CEQA background. So.
And Gordon was one of the founding members of the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. So absolutely, you do have expertise, Gordon.
I really don't have expertise in CCS. You know, that's stuff that I think we're going to need to have some.
But community level impacts, yeah. And I would be happy to connect you with the Center for Biological Diversity folks via email.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Gordon. Any other questions?
Oh, are you still listening? Am I still on?
Yes.
The other project, the Chevron project, I don't know much about. Apparently, according to the newspaper article recently last week, they're going to be doing a CUP, a conditional use permit, with the county, and I don't really know. The county does its best to keep local folks in the dark about these things. If you have some way of following this and get a hold of the information on the CUP, I would like that you forward some of that to me too, because we need to work together on these things. I think I've worked with CBD before on a lot of issues.
Very happy to share that information. As soon as we saw that press release, we submitted a records request to the county. I'm sure they're sick of hearing from us, but that's too bad.
We're sick of hearing from me too, I'll tell you. But in any case, I
will be happy to share them broadly and work together.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And next up is Thomas Helm.
Hey, everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Tom Helm from Valley Improvement Projects, also an EJAC member. I heard a lot about Covanta's biomass plants down there in the Southern Valley. Up here in Stanislaus, Covanta has a trash incinerator. I know it emits carbon as well as NOx and dioxin and other toxics. Is that facility being considered for a CCS project? Is it a type of facility that would be considered for one? Would it do anything to lower the other emissions besides carbon? What any other information you could give me about the harmful effects or you know, anything else about that if you've heard anything? Thanks.
That's a really good question. So we know that the company Clean Energy Systems wants to replicate what they had proposed in Mendota and Delano across 3 to 5 additional facilities. And when we saw records about that, they said that they want to look at biomass facilities that have already been shut down and to then restart them and add carbon capture and storage. And so they didn't name what those other facilities would be. But that had been how they were framing what their business proposal and vision was. So I don't know specifically about Stanislaus, but to your question about the other pollutants, I think one important thing to keep in mind is that even if these companies are saying that they are going to capture a certain amount of the carbon, that doesn't mean that it's the same thing as capturing the other pollutants. And I wanted to just flag something that we had heard from one of the companies where they said, oh, well, we're capturing the carbon. That means we'll also capture all the other harmful air pollution and just inject that underground too. But there's nothing in the law, there's nothing in the regulations that supports that premise that says even if you were to capture these air pollutants and put them underground, there are no regulations about how those are stored, if they're guaranteed to be stored. And the technology that captures carbon is different than what you would have with other air pollutants. And so I think that that's a dubious premise. And so even if there is carbon capture, there's likely, almost assuredly, to be other air pollutants along with that.
I would just add to that answer that the experts that I've spoken to talk about co-pollutants dramatically increasing the corrosivity of the solution and jeopardizing the well infrastructure. And so people that inject things underground, you know, don't believe that you can squish those things into supercritical because we're talking about compressing a gas, and also that anyone that tries to do it would absolutely damage their infrastructure. So it's a reckless claim and somebody needs to sort it out. We shouldn't be fielding it at this level.
I also want to add that the idea of injecting the carbon deep into rock and this assumption that there's nothing there, that it is not an ecosystem unto itself, I think is a dangerous assumption. And I think throughout this process, what we have found is a lot of dangerous assumptions, unwillingness to look at what it means in terms of potential for catastrophic accidents and to put that into the modeling. I think both at the CARB level, but I think the proponents of projects aren't thinking about these things. And for those folks, I just want to say, because what I've heard from folks, but it's an emergency and we have to try everything. And I feel like, you know, yes, how about we actually try doing it? Leading with justice. I say, try everything. We haven't tried that, right? We want a magic solution to our unwillingness to change our behavior. And I think all of us know in our personal lives that doesn't work, and it's not going to work for the climate either. So I'm just seeing if there's other questions. Are there other questions? I'm sorry.
I was just saying thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I see no other hands. And so if we don't have other questions, I'm going to, we're at 6:33. I don't know if other speakers want, oh, wait, we do have a question. Cynthia Mellon, unmute yourself.
Hi there, this is Cynthia Mendota. I'm speaking from Newark, New Jersey. I'm with Climate Justice Alliance, and New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. And it's more of a comment. This company, Covanta, we're very familiar with. They try to do garbage incinerators all over the world. We have the biggest one on the East Coast in my town. And one of the things we learned about that is that, you know, the ash from all the terrible things that they've been burning, besides being a mass polluter that emits dioxin and TCBs, there's under those incinerators, there's just masses and masses of toxic ash. I haven't been able to visualize how that's actually stored, but if they're talking about injecting more stuff exactly at that site, that sounds like a problem to me. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. That's all I wanted to share.
As you can see, the world is watching California. I want to add that we've gotten calls from activists and folks in Texas and Louisiana, in Iowa, deeply concerned that if this is what California is calling leadership, then environmental justice communities and communities living on the front lines of fossil fuel production are actually in the crosshairs with this technology. And that just can't be ignored. Al, is that a new hand or an old hand?
New hand.
Okay.
I just wanted to say also, I mean, being a retired chemist, I still read chemical engineering news, and they're talking about all these wonderful facilities, Louisiana, where they're going to be injecting carbon dioxide, another big effort up in Canada. So this is all over the place, and just, you know, more to be aware of. And, you know, if the rest of the world is watching California, we should hope that we can help the rest of the world.
Thank you, Al. And next question is Tolly.
Yes, hi all, my name is Tolly Rimberg. I'm a researcher at Harvard University. Thank you so much for this presentation discussion. One thing I'm really struck by is the fact that the scoping plan essentially punts on any planning and says cap and trade will deal with this massive chunk of decarbonization, which was talked about in this presentation. And you know, I personally see the profit motive of these companies as a massive obstacle and completely incongruent with decarbonization of our energy system. And you know, I think looking at what activists have been calling for after the wildfires at PG&E started, and calls to basically switch to public ownership, I wonder if you all could comment on the idea of democratizing some of these energy systems and actually calling explicitly for public ownership demands, and whether you see that as feasible politically, and you know, actually connecting that to a planned phase out where we don't have to then fight just the fact that these oil companies want to keep making money, want to keep polluting, and will keep polluting these communities. So I wanted to pose that, and thank you again for the conversation.
Do any of our panelists want to take that on?
I'm sorry, I missed the specific question. I heard the part about the lack of real planning for all of this, which I think, you know, goes back to the comment on AB 1314 that we can't even talk about this issue because they're trying to use climate incentive dollars to extract more oil. The fact that I'm still speculating about strategies and concerns, and you guys all deserve better. The history teacher's concerns about a technical strategy, but there's nobody silencing me with authoritative research. So I think totally you're right to be worried about this plan. It doesn't have the research and the confidence that it deserves.
And I think that the second part of the question is, are we looking at more, how do we democratize? I think the power grid, but I think maybe Tully, you said something broader, but I'm gonna, Connie, go for it.
Yeah, community solar projects are certainly a part of a number of EJ organizations' portfolios of work. As we know, it's interesting you bring up cap and trade, because the one sector that has made a fair amount of progress and really hit targets, sort of carrying the weight for all the other sectors right now for California, is the electricity sector, and that's because they do have a renewable portfolio standard that does force, regulates, does its job to regulate an actual phase out, and has a long-term planning process for that. But community solar is really important in terms of communities having self-determination, ownership stake. It's, a job generator for communities, and there are lots of really great local projects, like in East Oakland, there's the People Powered Solar Cooperative, and certainly campaigns to hold groups like PG&E, organizations like that accountable. Of course, there's a lot of advocacy, and yet we haven't seen necessarily the leadership that we would have liked to see from the PUC or, dare I say, even the governor's office, in holding PG&E accountable for starting these fires. And of course, as we know, wildfire emissions are a huge source of concern, unpredictable concern. But of course, if we had more accountability over our utilities, then and better governance of our utilities, perhaps we could make that more certain. Oh, I should also say that currently the California State Scoping Plan draft in the electricity sector posits new gas builds, about 10 gigawatts in its recommended scenario right now. And so, I really appreciate, the visioning work that, communities at a local level are really trying to do right now. But right now we're, really playing defense, or really trying to not, to prevent California from regressing in its goals right now. Because if so many other sectors rely on electrification, but we sort of follow, legislative loopholes to, punt or drag our feet on electrification, the electricity sector goals, then we're really not going to hit any goals in any other sectors either. So.
Martha, we can't hear you.
I think what Connie's saying is exactly right. I mean, and being on the defense means that you don't give, we have limited resources, limited staffing, limited funding. The big funding is not coming to the environmental justice community, which is unfortunate, which means that we're always playing defense. And when we have to play defense, we're not, it takes our time and energy and thinking away from exactly those kinds of solutions. And I want to give an example, and then I'll hand it over to Marjane. What we heard today, that one of the impediments, this idea that everything has to be large, right? So we can't have large scale solar in the desert because of the desert tortoise. And one of our members from the EJAC who's on the call was like, well, we've got a lot of rooftop that we could do, right? And so this thinking that is part of that we can continue on an economy that has continuous growth and that doesn't have impacts on the environment and how we live is a problem. And that's deeply embedded in the assumptions that CARB is making, right? We cannot hurt the economy. Well, we can't hurt the fossil fuel economy. That's sacred. But other sectors that could grow, the resilience economy, the clean economy, the caring economy, is where we should be looking. But again, those ideas are crowded out because we're looking for a magic bullet, or again, not to change our behavior. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Marjane.
Yeah, I just wanted to address the part that you asked, that you asked whether energy democratization is feasible or not. So I think we are facing an assault from multiple fronts. It's not just, it's not that, folks are not trying to push the energy democratization, but currently CPUC actually has a draft proposal that will they will actually force people to pay a monthly fee for having solar panels on the rooftops. And they will also decrease dramatically the amount of money people would get back when they sell the energy back to the grid. So, So I mean, right now, I think it's all pushing in all fronts.
Thanks, Marjane. Any more questions or comments from our speakers? And if not, I'm going to keep seeing if we have any more questions. Because if we don't have any more questions, we might be able to give you some time back. Oh, there we go. Kellen? Kellen has a hand up, or did I just lose them? There. If you could unmute yourself, Kellen, and ask your question.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I wanted to thank you for this presentation, and I really wanted to know, like, what, if you would want us to say one thing to the powers that be or our legislators or whoever's in charge, like what message can we carry towards a more equitable solution?
So just one thing. There's a lot of things. I don't think there's just one thing, because the underpinnings of this strategy are rooted in this concept that we can get to net zero without actually changing behavior. So it's a bigger question, right? It is about how the IPCC report has been cherry picked to justify this. And it is, so there's a lot of things, but what, if I got to say one thing, is stop making things worse. Like, this will not make things better for everybody. And if it doesn't, then just don't do it, especially the people who've been bearing the burden of that existing infrastructure. And with that, I want to hand it over to Catherine and to Matt and folks who are folks who are living every day with this threat that this practice will continue.
Yeah, thanks, Martha Dina. I mean, I think you're right on in kind of challenging the overall worldview that has gotten us here, right? And the idea that by repeating the same patterns and the same behaviors, that somehow we're going to get a different result when it's obvious that we're not. So I'll just repeat what I said earlier: no decisions about us without us, right? That being a very fundamental principle, that if you're going to propose to cite something in a community, the first thing you should be doing is going out and talking to the people that live there. And that's very often what, especially with these projects, we're finding out years down the road, right? There have already been all kinds of plans, all kinds of baked in assumptions, all kinds of negotiations that have happened behind the scenes, and we're often just on the receiving end of it. And that power dynamic fundamentally has to change. And I'm sure others have great thoughts that they could add as well.
Yeah, just on that thread, I mean, Martha, you said it earlier today, like, we've had to become the research arm of this whole process to ask questions that they never bothered to ask. I think of all the different innovative strategies local organizations come up with to address the things that are impacting their community. So this radical early inclusion of community insights, community questions, community direction is not a charity that traditional institutions are giving to us. It should be a perfectly self-interested, greedy acquisition of intellectual property that we have from the front lines. You know, you should pay these communities for it. But even if you didn't learn from your kindergarten teacher that being fair is a good idea, you should have learned from your economics professor that making more money and taking less risk and wasting less time on the opportunity costs of cooking up stuff that nobody wants is good for, your bank account. Even if you don't care about the suffering in these communities, you should at least get paid by working with these communities. And, if you can't be decent, at least be greedy and be smart about it. But this is like a weird cultural spiral we find ourselves in. And it goes back to Tully's question about democratizing energy in California. You trying to get us killed, dude? Like, we got a 19th century monopoly telling our state what we're allowed to do to it. They're not going to democratize it. All the money they make is off building giant projects. Like, this is, that is a perfect microcosm for what's wrong with how we make these decisions.
Yeah, I heard an interesting thing from European advocates, and I know that there are representatives from the oil industry here, but I'm going to say it anyway. You know, what the European advocates were saying is that in some ways the fossil fuel industry needed to be disintermediated from some of the policy decisions, because what we don't want is any more decide, announce, and defend. And what somebody decides with a lot of money, regulatory agencies then are put in a position of defending those, announcing and defending, right? That's where you have the unrealistic assumptions and all these other very gaslighty kind of things that get embedded in analysis to justify a policy that is benefiting not environmental justice communities. That is not benefiting environmental justice communities. Spoke backwards. I've been wondering who you are, on the other hand, George. So please ask your question.
Hi there. I am not, on the other hand, George. I'm a activist for 350.org, and I work in the Bay Area, and we work heavily on the Richmond refinery issues, and pollution being the primary one for the minority community in that area. So one of the things that I am also working on is the solutions, and I am really happy that you guys are presenting the details around what is happening with this kind of shell game, pardon the pun, where, you know, the carbon emissions are coming from a refinery, and now they're going to capture those carbon emissions from that refinery while they're still emitting those carbon emissions, and maybe nobody will notice. There's a lot of game playing going on with these refineries, and then also with the creation of petrochemical products, just so that this entire stranded asset that is, you know, leveraging these companies can still be in play. So this is our primary concern, is that we've got, you know, a real fiscal economic problem undermining the oil company's ability to say, okay, yeah, we'll just shut these down. Of course, we get it. So there's got to be a solution. Then many have been posed. Meanwhile, you know, we're running around doing whack-a-mole, trying to shut down refineries that are doing other things with their oil in order to stay in business. So I really would love to see that question addressed, or that concern addressed, because it does go to the heart of one of the problems behind oil companies staying in business. And it's a hard one to solve. You know, it's a business problem. And I just am wondering what you guys are thinking about that.
Oh, there's a lot of ways to respond. It is, I think it's beyond a business problem. It's a culture and how we view it problem, right? We need a just transition. These industries aren't going to shut down overnight. And I don't, you know, but if we don't get serious about what the transition looks like, including the democratizing of our systems, you know, stop allowing companies to, and it could be as simple as, you know, bills that don't allow companies to push their external costs onto government and to people, right? There's lots of ways that the transition can be and should be funded. And I think what we were hoping through the scoping plan is that we would actually start charting that course and make the agency understand that what it's doing is not just, you know, I think we had a hard time getting them to understand what the next market is, and that that's plastics, and that we should be thinking of the situation holistically. We still do things in silos, and we're at like 4 minutes, so I could keep going about this. So, but I do think it is a broad societal problem that will take many of us engaging. But it is as simple as saying we should stop doing the thing that got us here and begin the transformation, center the solutions on communities and workers, because we understand our communities and our families work in the industries that need to be transitioned. And many of, you know, at the end of the day, the fossil fuel industry has not provided a path out of poverty for many folks. Some folks have, but not a large number, right? Our communities still suffer from high rates of unemployment, high rates of, real lack of economic development and economic opportunities. So we should center on that and finding, that next generation of an economy that is not so extractive and centers on community wellness versus our ability to buy things, which is fun, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really fill the void of our humanity.
I feel compelled to say that history is instructive here, that our country has dropped some baggage and changed access and power and given people new opportunities, but only when we faced an existential threat that everybody recognized. And I think the climate threat still feels like something that privileged communities can skirt and shop their way out of and not suffer in. And, it may take that levee breach when the water stops going to Southern California and the food stops getting shipped around the state for them to realize that they're in it with us too. So I'm worried that it's going to actually take, ecological catastrophe, as if the wildfires weren't a signal enough. But, they could drive to Lake Tahoe before that fire went there. And it's going to find them everywhere. But they've been able to externalize so much of these consequences. You'd think smoke floating over to New York City from Oregon was enough of a signal. But our ability to play dumb about this shit is amazing.
I'm thinking about the last question asked, what can we ask, the powers that be? And I think it's really to, remind them that they are the powers that be. There is no one else. There is no one else. And the powers that be need to, the latest IPCC report that came out, one of the major findings was really not about how urgent the climate crisis is, because we already knew that, it just got worse. But really that we have the technology, it's within reach in terms of cost, but it's a matter of political will. It's a matter of political courage and political transparency and honesty and some accountability, to say what we tried for the past few years didn't work, or it wasn't good enough. Right? When we see GHG emissions rising and PM2.5 particulate matter pollution rising in refinery communities, when that's regulated under cap and trade, the only sector making progress is electricity. And we see new studies from international sectors coming out saying that these low demand scenarios where you change the way that we operate, where we have community level solar, these studies are saying that these are actually more deployable. We have to change the way that our society is structured and the way that we operate. We have to have political courage, but the powers that be are the people who have to do that. We can do as much research as we want. We will build people power. We will, push to make them listen, but ultimately the people in power are the ones who have to make that decision.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Matt, and all the speakers. Catherine, do you want to close us out? Or...
Yeah, I just, again, really appreciate everybody for joining this evening. We'll be sure that the recording gets posted so that it's in a publicly accessible place. Really appreciate the panelists for showing up, the audience for joining with us in some discussion. And yeah, definitely a lot of work ahead of us still, but together, we're stronger. So appreciate everybody's different levels of expertise, energy, to be able to move forward the solutions we want and hopefully prevent some of this bad stuff from coming to our communities.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. I got to see you in real life and Zoom today.
I know. We're living in Orwell's future. We're arguing with doublespeak, and we're in two places at once.
Right.
That might be more Aldous Huxley. Thanks, Martha. It was good seeing you. It's nice to see us getting some traction on this.
Leticia y Rocio, muchas gracias.
Thanks, Rocio. Bye.
Adios.